Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to Godsplaining. I am today's host, Father Patrick Mary Briscoe, because I wrested the powers of headship away from Father Janczyk Bertrand Janczyk, so I am in the lead today. Ha! Oh, by the way, I'm accompanied today by Father Jacob Bertrand Janczyk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hello, Father.
Here I am. Hey there. How you doing? Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure to host you today on Godsplaining.
Yeah.
One thing that's kind of fun about this episode is that Father Jacob Bertrand and I are both in Washington, D.C. at the House of Studies, recording from opposite sides of the building. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. One day we'll get like a mixer and be able to sit in the same room. But this has been happening for 2 years. So why, if it's not broken, don't fix it. That's the saying, right? I don't know. Also, it's great. It's great. This is awesome. So yeah, here we are, both in D.C. So Father Gregory left, got the boot, and then we moved Father Patrick in. So just took a year to get another Godsplainer back in the house.
That's right. Don't worry. First thing I did was throw out that extra long mattress, though.
Yeah. For those who have never seen Father Gregory, he's tall. He's the tallest of us. So there you have it.
Well, one thing that's kind of nice too about this episode is that we've come to the end of the summer chaos, right? We did all these different kinds of things. You had a couple cool trips. Yeah, tell us about your summer.
Yeah, mostly out of Colorado this summer with Focus's summer project. So that was cool. So most of the summer in Colorado Springs, we had a bunch of camping trips and other kind of adventures. So I made my way as far west as Utah and I drove to Colorado and drove out to Utah for that trip. So my car got a lot of additional miles, but it was cool. I don't love road trips, but I was with some fun people for all of the driving. So that made it good. Yeah, those were the big trips. There was a family wedding earlier in the summer. Father Patrick was actually at. My sister got married back in June, so came back east for that, and we came back east again for the Godsplaining retreat in July. But that was kind of it, and now settled back here. And Father Patrick is settled here, and you were with summer projects, not in Colorado, but in Maine a bit. So that was part of your summer adventure besides moving to the House of Study. So same program, different location. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was great. I came home and I said to Father Jacob Bertrand, "Hey, I'm outdoorsy now."
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He laughed.
Yeah.
He wasn't sure that I believed, but I did climb Cadillac. That's my, claim to adventure.
Yes.
And it was
he
quite
climbed
treacherous.
a mountain called Cadillac, not a mountain in a Cadillac. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
Lest you think that the latter sounds more like me. I did accomplish the former. We took the west side down, which no one does because it's very treacherous, apparently. A fact which we realized about halfway down.
Naturally. Yeah, of course.
So that part was very exciting. We also saw an otter on Otter Cliffs. I think that's something poetic about that. It had a fish in its mouth. So that's a big deal. Yeah, very exciting. All the wildlife,
Yeah. That's really great. You're like I can't think of a name of somebody. Well, who are the people who went out to the wilderness in Massachusetts? The poets, Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. What were their names? You know who I'm talking about. I can't think of their names.
It's more fun to just kind of watch this happen, though.
Yeah. Well, it was your own.
Right.
I was thinking Walt Whitman, but
Thoreau.
he's from Thoreau, the Henry David Thoreau.
Yep, thank you. Thoreau. Yeah, that's right. Trudeau is fine. Yeah, close
Trudeau.
enough. Yeah. Trudeau. Father Trudeau.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Now we've totally descended into chaos.
Move on.
It's time. It's time to start the episode. So today we want to talk about the traditional elements of the Mass that's known as the Novus Ordo, or the Mass of Paul VI. So we're talking about the Mass as most people experience it in their Catholic parishes. So this Mass was promulgated and after the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, so 1972 and onward. So Father Jacob Bertrand, why don't you talk about some of the main differences between this Mass and the Mass as it was celebrated prior to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council? Just say a little bit about the general experience.
Yeah, I think, and I guess just to kind of give a little context too, one of the things we're taught in our preaching classes is never to talk about the preparation for the preaching when you start to preach. Like yesterday, I was thinking about this and came up with my homily, like just preach. But I'm going to break that rule. And that Father Patrick and I were batting around this idea of this episode earlier in the summer. And then the Holy Father came out with the motu proprio in the summer. Now we're doing it after. So we still think it's worth talking about the masses. It's on people's minds. So I think comparing and talking about how we live the Mass as it's the center really of our prayer together as the church is super important. So good to continue the conversation. So if we're looking, and just broadly speaking, because as Dominicans, we wouldn't even celebrate the form of the Mass that this document that the Holy Father issued. The Dominican rite's not even mentioned in this document. So just talking about the old forms of the Mass versus the new form, or the Novus Ordo, as Father Patrick explained, the form that most Catholics would experience. A couple of the big things that people would notice would, especially from the pews, I mean, there would be bigger differences that perhaps that priests who celebrate would notice, but especially from the pews, I think the two big things, and I'll lump a third in there, but the two big things would be the language. The Novus Ordo, in the new form of the Mass, there was permission given in the church documents to celebrate the Mass in what's called the vernacular, or the spoken language of the people in the given area. So in the old form, the Mass is only celebrated in Latin. Everything's the readings, the prayers, all of that, the chant, the music, it's all in Latin. In the new form, there is permission to celebrate in the vernacular. The other big thing is the orientation of the priest. So in the old form, the priest always faces ad Orientem, or the proper or to the proper orientation towards the east. Churches would have typically been built with the sacristy. If you were standing in the pews looking into the sacristy, into the sanctuary, not the sacristy, into the sanctuary, you'd be looking east at the rising sun, which symbolized Christ and the resurrection. So the priest would be facing the same way as the people. In the Novus Ordo, there was a recommendation and instruction that altars should be or could be moved away from the wall so that the Mass could be celebrated versus populum, or towards the people, so facing the people. And that's growing up for me, of course, that was always my experience of the Mass in English and with the priest facing the people. So those are the two big, immediate kind of like, whoa, big changes going on. The other thing that we'll talk a bit more about, but the third thing in this list that I started out on is the way by which music is done. So there were, I mean, things changed gradually over time in the 20th century, but a big shift from chant, Gregorian chant, to more hymnody and at its worst, kind of like I don't know, folk music in the Mass, but a big shift towards hymnody and congregational singing of the parts of the Mass. That's not a bad thing, but that would be the third thing. I don't know, you might have a few more, and there certainly are more things, but those are the big three, I think, noticeable things that we would, experience attending, I wasn't alive in the 60s when this change was made, but if we were there, those would be the big three on my mind.
One of the things that we constantly go back to, and I think it's worth saying now as we begin this reflection, is so many of these changes were just promulgated and they just happened. So one thing that I brought up to Father Jake Bertrand as we were talking about this was our experience of the change of the Mass was very carefully crafted. So, for example, when the new translation was promulgated, so the new translation of the Mass in English, we went to lots of training sessions. There was all kind of information, and for years, when you walked into a church, you'd find pew cards with the new responses. So most people remember the changes affecting them, because now instead of saying "and also with you," we say "and with your spirit," right? We went to training sessions. There was a very long process of integration. People knew it was coming. They had some sense of what to expect. There were publications of different parts beforehand. Parishes had sessions about it. But what's often told to us is that the changes after the Second Vatican Council were nothing like that. They were just sweeping. And suddenly, these elements of tradition that were very important to many were modified in ways that were surprising, and I think in ways that are still impacting the church. So that's part of why we want to talk about these three traditions in particular, to see how they can continue to influence the life of the church now, and to see the connection between the Old Mass, the Tridentine Rite Mass, the Old Latin Mass, and the Mass as it's presently celebrated. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else to that effect.
Yeah, no, just kind of an anecdote. I remember, I think it was on when we were novices, we were visiting one of our parishes where our novitiate wasn't, and the pastor at the time was sort of doing, I think he's still the pastor, was doing some renovations in the church, some actually pretty cool stuff. And one of the things that they were doing was they had installed a sort of mosaic in the floor of the sanctuary in marble, with the Dominican shield, or of the Dominican shield on the floor. And what they had done is that marble that they used to make that shield was the marble that had made up the old communion rail in the church. And what had happened is that, kind of overnight, the communion rail was smashed and thrown away. So one Sunday it was there, the next it was gone. People just came and their church looked totally different with no sort of instruction, no explanation as to why. And parishioners found pieces of the marble and kept it. And then when the pastor found out this was the case and they could kind of repurposing the sanctuary and making it really quite beautiful again, they used that marble that couldn't be reconstructed into the rail, but into the mosaic. So to sort of, obviously it's not the same thing, but just an anecdote to illustrate how Father Patrick was saying that it was just kind of overnight sweeping reforms of the liturgy. And though those reforms may have been well-intentioned, they were certainly not they were not accompanied by good catechesis and that sort of thing. So it was kind of something that swept in unhelpful ways.
Yeah, so to that end, let's jump into the first of these, the orientation of the Mass. I mean, one thing that I think is important to note is that the Roman Missal still gives the instructions as if the priest were celebrating Mass ad Orientum, that is, facing the east. And I want to say a couple things about that. First, the point of language. Sometimes people say, "Oh, you mean the priest with his back to the people?" Well, that's in my mind actually a very loaded and a very divisive way to say that, and that conveys a certain ideology of what the Mass is. I think it's better to describe it objectively and to say things like the language Father Jacob Bertrand was using, that the priest is facing the east, because that is in fact the liturgical custom, that is the tradition, that everyone would face the same direction praying. I think another thing that's important to see about this is because when we pray the Mass in this direction, we have an understanding that the priest is a mediator. So according to the Catholic Church, we believe that the priest stands in persona Christi Capitis, that he is there in the person of Christ the head. And by his configuration through holy orders, the priest can do things in the name of Christ in a special way. And one of those is to communicate the graces of God to the people of God. And when everyone is facing the same way, there's a stronger sense of this kind of chain, this movement, that the priest is not doing something himself, but rather the priest is standing between God and God's people. And I think those two things are very important. They're not just linguistic, but they convey theological principles.
Yeah, I think Father Mike Schmitz, I think it was him, and I think it might have been at a Focus conference, either Seek or SLS a few years ago. I'm sure you could find this on YouTube if you look, but he gave a talk on the Mass, and this point came up, and what he, about the priest's posture, the way he's facing during the Mass. And what he said and the way he described it, and I thought, that's a way to think about it, is that, the priest as mediator, as Father Patrick was explaining, is facing God with the people and saying to the people as the mediator, come with me, come with me up the mountain, come with me to meet the Lord. And what that point brings out is the fact that as priests, Father Patrick, myself, all priests, we're not some sort of, our priesthood exists within the church. We're called to be priests, but we're first Christians, and we're called out of the Christian people to serve the Christian people. So even the sacrifice of the Mass, like the graces of the Mass, I mean, they still, God willing, sanctify us and the graces of the Eucharist. And we are set aside in a way to mediate, but also to mediate with and as part of the mystical body. So doing that together as a priest, at least in my experience, is really spiritually edifying to have that opportunity and to be able to worship with the people in the same way. And the other thing too, as Father Patrick mentioned, is that the general instruction, it's kind of a terrible name, the germ. It's called the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. It's
Yeah,
like,
bad
if I
acronym.
just say it, it's a bad acronym. Yeah. But it gives instruction as to when the priest should turn and face the people. And what that does is, as he was saying, as Father was saying, is that, well, there's a presumption that he's at times not facing the people. But if you were to listen to the prayers that the priest prays at Mass, he prays to specific people during the Mass. There are times when he prays to God or one of the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, or Holy Spirit. And then there are times when he prays with or for the people. And it's those times that he ought to face the people. And there are times when it makes sense, like facing God when you're talking to God makes sense with the people. So there's a kind of at least I think the point that we're trying to make is that there is twofold, that there's a sort of intelligibility as to why it would make sense to consider having the priest face east, faced in a particular direction. It also makes sense as to why the priest would turn to talk to the laity, to the people in the pews at certain times. But then really what I think specifically at this time in the church's liturgical life, to see that there's a continuity between the old rite and the new rite, that there's not a hard slash, that there really is kind of this rich tradition that it exists in both forms of the Mass.
The last thing I'll say about this before we cut to our break and then get to these other two ideas about the direction of the Mass is that when the priest is celebrating the Mass ad Orientum, facing the East, it cuts back on the number of ways that he can add his own personality into the liturgy. And I think this is a good thing, because I think one of the difficulties of the Novus Ordo, one of the difficulties of Mass as we experience it, is that so much weight is being put on the priest to be an engaging celebrant, to be a kind of entertainer of sorts. And that weight is heavy, it's hard to bear, and some priests don't carry it well. And so when the normative mode is ad Orientum, there's a kind of what's the right word here? There's a kind of uniformity to worship, and a certain humility is put upon the priest, because I think by default this mode of celebrating, this orientation, allows the priest to be more humble. So with that, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about music in the liturgy, and then we're also going to talk about language in the liturgy. So stay tuned.
You are listening to Godsplaining. Visit us at godsplaining.org to listen to our episodes, shop our store, and donate to our podcast. All gifts go to improving the podcast and bringing the gospel to more listeners. Thanks for your support.
Well, friends, welcome back to Godsplaining. Thanks for sticking with us. If you make it to the second half of the episode, I always feel like you deserve an award, because you could cut and run after the first half. So if you've made it this far, you're really in. You must be very curious then about the use of language in the liturgy and the kind of Mass that you hear at Mass. So let's turn to that first. Let's turn to that first of these two remaining points. That sounds like something Aquinas would have written. Of the two things that remain, we now turn to the first.
That's great.
The second half has two parts. Now to the first part of the second half.
How well formed you've been in the Thomistic tradition.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's turn to the importance of Latin, even still in the liturgy. Father Jacob Bertrand, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So there's a real. So I think with the liturgy, maybe I should stop saying I think. That was one of my goals this summer, to cut I think when I'm saying something that is like true out of my language and speech, and I haven't done it. So there is a document from the Second Vatican Council called Sacro Sanctum Concilium, that if you're wondering where are these Dominicans getting these things, you can look that up and read it, and that's really where we're pulling from. That was the document that issued in the changes largely on liturgical reform. And the document, Sacro Sanctum Concilium, is abundantly clear that Latin is to be preserved in the church's liturgy and the worship. Why? Just to say that it is, I mean, is it because God speaks Latin? Probably, or French or something. I don't know. Maybe some other language. I don't know. Is it that reason? That's probably not the reason. Yeah, Hebrew, Aramaic. That's probably not the reason the Council Fathers thought that Latin ought to be preserved, but really because of its traditional place and its universal place in the church. That Latin has been used as the language of the church for centuries, and so it kind of becomes institutionalized, and it also becomes globalized in that Latin is the language of the church, so that if you were worshiping in one part of the world or another, you would at least have familiarity with the Mass and that sort of thing. It reminds me very much, the argument for Latin reminds me very much of the argument for the creation of the Dominican Rite, the traditional form of the Mass for us, which was really just to have uniformity as the friars traveled throughout Europe, because each region had different variations of the Mass. So the master of the order at the time said, let's have one, so that as we travel, we can have uniformity. I think that argument holds for the use of Latin too. So the document though says that Latin should be used it should be preserved in the Roman Rite, and there should be steps taken that the faithful may be able to say or sing together in Latin. And I think that's really important. That goes back to the point that Father Patrick made earlier, that we, if there is to be a sort of holding on to or a revitalization or reintroduction of Latin in our worship. Does everything need to be in Latin? I don't think so. But does there need to be catechesis on things? Do we need to be taught? Yes, we do. And actually, in the document, in the document from Pope Francis is one of the things he recommends. So I think that's important. But it's also, I think we have to recognize that the Sacrosanctum Concilium recognizes that the vernacular is helpful. And one of the things that Father Patrick and I, when we talk about liturgical things, often hearken back to is the change in the masses in the lectionary. So in the readings that we have. So one of the changes that came into the Mass from the old rite to the Novus Ordo to the new rite is that the readings were expanded. The cycle was expanded, so we get much more of the Bible throughout the year in the church, but we also get the readings in English. And I think that's a helpful thing if we're going to be preaching on the readings in English, and if there's not such people don't understand the readings, it makes it much more difficult. So I think there's a good reality in that too. So I don't know if you have more thoughts about Latin in English or Latin in the vernacular if you're living elsewhere, but some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that I think that knowing at least the Mass parts in Latin is a way of deferring to the global and international nature of the church. I mean, I actually think in this case it's really helpful that the Latin is a dead language. So I've heard of historical incidents, for example, in Africa, where bishops not wanting to default to one or another tribal language insisted that Mass just had to be celebrated in Latin, even in the Novus Ordo, and that Latin is not just a uniform or a particular standard, but that it is actually the kind of thing that unites us together, because Latin by its nature is not spoken in any particular country. So it's a kind of neutral territory, and a place that doesn't favor one nation or race against another. And I think that's really important to think of in our age. And it's a beautiful thing to have that expression of faith when you go to a major pilgrim site in the Holy Land or in Europe, and you hear the prayers of the church prayed in Latin by all kinds of different people. I mean, it's really an extraordinary sign of the church's unity. So that's just kind of a reframing, or an echoing of some of the points Father Jacob Bertrand was making.
Yeah, I think that kind of sums up my thoughts on it. I think you hit that right on the head.
So even in the Novus Ordo, the Mass of Paul VI, or the Mass subsequent to the reforms of 1970, Latin should, I think, have a preeminent place in the liturgy, that the faithful should be encouraged to learn the basic prayers of the Church in Latin. I've been saying the Mass parts, and by that I'm referring to the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Holy, 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 and perhaps even the Creed. So I could learn it in English first, and then I could learn it in Latin. But I think there's a kind of baseline here that is an invitation, because when we learn these things in another language, we're invited to reflect on the meaning of the words and to re-encounter them. So I think it has that kind of spiritual benefit for someone who's taking on that project too. Okay, so with that, let's turn to our last point of reflection on the liturgy, music. Father Jacob Bertrand, you want to narrate a little bit the situation of church music?
Yeah, and referring again to the same document, the Sacrosanctum Concilium, for notes on on how music ought to inform our liturgical worship in the Mass, and the liturgy at large, really. So one of the things with music that I think we have to recognize is that singing in the Mass, it's a dispositive reality, in as much as it makes us better worshipers and more receptive to receive the grace that's being offered. And this is if you think about the way that we worship as Catholics, this is how so many of the pieces of our liturgical worship work, from our body positions of standing, kneeling, sitting, from the stained glass windows, from the smells and bells, as it were, the incense and the sounds, and the way the priest moves and the way the altars, all of that is meant to help us, aid us in our worship. So to music. So I think that's really important in thinking. Okay, I think that is really important in thinking about the way in which music is approached. Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document again that reformed the liturgy, says this about chant: the Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. Okay, so that's full stop. That's the music of the Church is Gregorian chant. You can't have it any other way. That's just simply what it is. Now, can you incorporate other things? Hymns? Sure. Can you incorporate other types of music? Yeah, you can. The document also says that polyphony, or like if you think sacred harmonized music, other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations, so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action. And then regarding instruments, the document says that it is the organ, the pipe organ, that is held in, quote, high esteem, and should be used for worship. Other instruments can be used; they may be admitted. Not really, not the highest. So why though? Why is chant, and then polyphony less so than chant? Why is chant so important to our worship? Well, because chant, above everything else, above any other form of music, is text-based. It is focused on the word, namely the word of Scripture. And the chant that we chant, the things that we sing in the context of Mass, ought to draw us into Christ, who is the Word. So when chant is sung, it is easier to understand the word, what is being said. It is less distracted by music and harmonies, and how polyphony has all the different kind of movements at once in there. But it helps us understand the word better. There's also a reality, and perhaps we won't spend as much time talking about this, but the sacredness, the otherness of worship, as liturgical music gets closer and closer to secular music, it becomes less and less sacred and more secular. And what happens in a church ought to not reflect the profane, but the sacred. So there's something to be said for having a sort of music, a type of music that is reserved for liturgical worship, for the worship of God, that isn't also played on the radio or at a party, or those kind of things, or sounds like things that are played on the radio or at a party. There should be some otherness that draws us into the mystery of liturgical worship.
I think if our listeners want a real kind of wild visual of this, the kind of thing we're talking about, and to really see the way the Second Vatican Council changed music in the church, they should look up Elvis Presley and Mary Tyler Moore's 1969 classic American film, Change of Habit. At the end of the film, you can find this on YouTube. At the end of the film, there's this wild scene where the Mass is still being celebrated as a traditional Mass. So the priest is facing ad Orientum, and there's Latin in the liturgy, and things are pretty solemn, with the exception of Elvis Presley standing in the sanctuary with a guitar. It's a pretty wild contrast, and certainly offers some food for thought about the nature of music and the liturgy and the way the changes may or may not have been adapted.
It would have been fine if you were in the choir loft. I mean, that would,
it's a pretty wild scene. As regards music, I mean, the church invites and calls for enculturation. We know that the church, because of the nature of the gospel of Jesus, adapts unto herself the traditions of every nation. And not only does she do that, she seizes these traditions but she cleanses and purifies them in the light of the gospel. So there's a tension here to be brought about and explored with the question of enculturation, liturgical music, and the clear and evident preferences of the council. I think personally in the United States, we're at a point where we should be animating efforts to teach chant and singing of traditional music, because the typical experience is not that. And so that indicates that we're further on one side of this question than on another. The teaching of chant, I think, has a very therapeutic and peaceful effect. I mean, people, when they can't sleep, they turn on CDs of Gregorian chant. And I think in an age when the liturgy should be solemn and reflective and should invite people to peace and to pray, to a kind of Sunday repose, that element is important and is really beneficial. So, Father Jacob Bertrand, do you have any closing remarks on these three elements of the Mass? Like, what are our action steps? What are we to do going forward? What do we want hearers to understand is important?
Yeah, I think two important points, and then a couple of wrap up thoughts. Super quick though. One is that the reason we're bringing these things up is to shed light on the continuity of the Church's liturgy throughout especially the 20th century. Now, have there been abuses and sort of crazy things that have disrupted that continuity? Yes, but did the Church envision that? No. So if you're interested in liturgical things in the Mass and you haven't read this document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, it's not terribly long, it might be worth doing that. The USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Bishops, also has documents on the liturgy. Those things are helpful just to get a sense of like, okay, what does the Church say and what does she provide for our worship? The other point here is the importance of catechesis that we've come back to a couple of times. As Father Patrick said, just throwing chant or throwing, this or that at a congregation, it just really is a repeat of what happened 60 years ago after the council, of just throwing things out and that kind of thing. And we can't abide that. We can't do that. And we're not called to do that. We're called to learn and to learn about our Lord and the way by which we are to worship him better, so as to enter into that better. And if we miss that point, then we're just, we're making the same mistakes. History is going to repeat itself. And that's a dangerous territory. So I guess the last thing that I'll say is what can we say and what can't we say? Well, with respect to the orientation of the priest, language, Latin or the vernacular, music, what we can say is that all of these can be used and should be used properly in the Mass. And in fact, we should be disposed to use them. That doesn't mean that every single Mass has to only have Gregorian chant. That's not what we're saying. But it's an invitation to dive into the rich tradition of our Church's liturgical worship, whether in the traditional rite or in the Novus Ordo. What we can't say is that we can't be using these things or we shouldn't be using these things, because the Church doesn't say that. So it's an invitation again to learn, to pray to pray better, to dive more deeply into our tradition and come to know our Lord in new and bigger ways.
Mic drop. By way of conclusion, I just want to take a moment to thank all of our listeners. If you like this episode, please share it on social media. Give it to someone in your parish who thinks could benefit from listening to us, that you think that they could benefit from listening to us. That was almost a coherent thought. I need more coffee, gosh. Please consider donating to the podcast. We appreciate the regular gifts of our Patreon supporters. As you've noticed, we've been hosting on Friday afternoons live splaining episodes. Those have been really dynamic and very well received. We want to thank you if you participated in those. If you haven't yet, check them out. Every other Friday at 3 p.m. on the YouTubes, that popular source of entertainment on the interwebs. We get together and talk about your questions. So if you listen to this episode and thought that wasn't really interesting to me, well, on a live splaining, we can talk about what you want to talk about. Finally, check out our merch. Godsplaining has a store. We have kidney packs. Fanny packs. Father Jacob Bertrand's a huge fan. He wears his around all the time. Pulls his phone in and out of it. Yeah.
I don't wear it all the time, but I have one.
It's his hiking pouch, his woodsman apparel. Yeah, that's right. Okay. But check out the merch. Support us that way and show your Godsplaining pride. Great. Please know of our gratitude to you for supporting us. And as always, be assured of our prayers. God bless.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Leave a review on your podcast app and visit us at godsplaining.org.